Okay, we're at 7:02, so we're going to get going and we'll hope that others will join. This is the last One Museum, One Book Club of the year, so thanks for being here. Tonight we're going to be discussing Train with the author, Ginium Cohen. I'll tell you a little bit about him in a minute, but let me first go over some of our logistics. So many of you have probably participated in this before. What we ask, if you have a comment, you can participate in one of three ways. You can put it in the chat and one of us will read it and maybe even ask you to comment on that. You can raise your hand using the Zoom function at the bottom of the page, or we actually keep an eye on your video if your video is on, and you can raise your hand physically like this. So Danny's going to run the discussion. Michelle and I will be helping him to make sure all of your comments are reflected. So if you take a minute right this second and put yourself on mute until we get going, that would be great. I want to let you know that my associate Michelle Daisy is here, as she usually is. So thank you, Michelle. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator and author tonight, Danny M. Cohen. Dr. Danny Cohen is an author, a learning scientist, and a musician. He's a distinguished professor of instruction at Northwestern and specializes in Holocaust memory and Holocaust film. And the design of human rights education. He's the author of the Choose Your Own Pathway Mystery, The 19th Window, the short story Dead Ends, and the historical novel Train, a selected teacher fellow text of the United States Holocaust Museum. And that's what we're talking about tonight, of course. Danny is the founder of the national nonprofit Unsilence. He was a faculty fellow at the Auschwitz Jewish Center, and he also is a member of the folk rock band They Won't Win. So with that, I'm going to introduce the multi-talented Ginium Cohen. Take it from here.
Thank you so much, Marcy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's really fun. I can't see many faces, but I do recognize many familiar names, including Lillian Gerstner and docents, and a special shout out to my mom, who is here. Oh, I also see Sam Goldberg. Lots of very friendly names. It's really good to be here. Shout out to my mom, Elaine Stein, who you may be able to see. I don't know who you can and can't see. I would love to see faces while we're having this conversation. So if you're able to turn on your camera, please do. That way, we're not just speaking into the void. So thank you. Hi, Cecilia. Hi, Gail. Oh my goodness, lots of old friends. Really wonderful. Thank you for being here. The intention of tonight is really to have you all sort of be in the driver's seat and have loads of opportunities to ask questions that you would like me to answer, and questions for us to discuss. It doesn't have to necessarily be a question for me. It could be a question for the whole group, where we could have a group conversation. Just to set some sort of like some boundaries, not that there need to be many boundaries, but I want to say that feel free to ask me anything. There's no question that's off limits. You can ask me about, we can talk about the content of the book, the story itself. We can talk about the characters. We can talk about the process of writing the book. We can talk about the history inside the book. We can talk about how the book is used in classrooms around the country. We can talk about pushback and how the book is considered to be controversial in some communities. So I just want to really welcome any questions. And again, thank you to the Illinois Holocaust Museum Education Center for hosting. So I really want to just sort of jump in and allow people to ask questions. Would anyone like to raise their hand or turn off or turn on your microphone and ask a question, or throw a question into the chat, and we can jump right in?
Hi again. So obviously we talked a little bit about the use of like this literature in schools, but I'm interested to hear, you mentioned like the controversy, which maybe I haven't followed. So if you kind of talk about that and like maybe where it's been a problem. I'm hitting hard in the first question, but I'm just maybe unaware of it.
Yeah, that's great. So I think the book has been controversial in a couple of ways, and it depends on the community that we're talking about. So I'll tell you one example, one little story, one anecdote that I could tell you. It was just around when the book was just first published, and we were excited because we were getting these narratives of the Nazis, Roma victims, disabled victims, gay victims, political victims. We're getting those narratives into classrooms and into communities around the country, and in many cases for the first time. Communities or teachers had not had the opportunity to talk about these particular parts of Holocaust history. And I got a call from a teacher in Ohio asking if I could send them a version of Train with the gay characters edited out. I got that request over email. It was their colleagues were copied. They were very excited to teach Train because they had never thought about teaching about the Nazis' disabled victims before, and they had this idea. They wanted to develop a curriculum or a unit specifically around the Nazis' T4 program, and they said, would you do us a favor? Would you be open to sending us a version of the book, but with Alex and Marco removed from the story? And I was surprised and not surprised at the same time. I was a little taken aback at sort of the audacity of the question, that I would, as if I would say, oh, sure, let me spend a couple of years rewriting the story. It took me 5 years to write the book in the first place. So it would take quite a while to remove 2 of the 6 protagonists, including the only Jewish protagonist, which would be obviously deeply problematic to remove Alex, who's the Jewish protagonist. But I decided to respond by saying, let's hop on a phone call. I didn't want to have a back and forth over email. So we jumped on the phone, and the teachers, I said, tell me where you're coming from. I was just fascinated as an educator with this request. And the teachers admitted that they were very worried about the parent body in the school. They were worried not about the students' reactions, but they said that they were worried about parent reactions. And they had received pushback before when they tried to teach texts that included gay characters. There are many, many, many schools. I grew up in the UK, as you can probably hear, and I lived under Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher was, her government was responsible for Section 28 of the Penal Code that banned any conversations about homosexuals in all schools across the UK, any government-funded schools. So I was quite used to the idea of censorship around LGBTQ narratives. So I wasn't surprised in that sense. But I was surprised with what the teacher said next. And the teacher said, we want you to, if you'd be open to it, would you take out these stories, these 2 characters? It's not as if that part of the history actually happened anyway. assuming or implying that I had inserted this fantasy into the Holocaust story, as if I invented the idea that the Nazis persecuted homosexuals, gay men specifically, and lesbians too, and people that we might call now label as bisexual or pansexual or transgender. And I responded and said, no, this history really did happen. Everything in the book is historically accurate, which is something we can talk about this evening if you're interested. The end of the story is the school decided not to teach it because I told them that I would not rewrite the story for them.
Hello. I cannot access the Zoom meeting. Can someone please help me access? I registered. I'm on an iPad. I have Zoom. The link from the Illinois Holocaust Museum is not working.
If you can hear us, then it's working. You're in the Zoom.
Well, I'm on my phone. I can't see you. I can only hear you.
There's a way to.
I'm
There's a way to activate video from your phone. So at the bottom, but Danny, back
unfortunately, it keeps when I click on the Zoom meeting link from the Holocaust Museum, it says sign in. It doesn't automatically go to Zoom. It just says sign in.
So you're in a room with 42 people who can hear you because you're in the Zoom. So maybe, can you hear the conversation?
I cannot see anything visually. I'm on my phone, my iPhone.
I understand, but given we're in the middle of this session with 42 people, is it okay for you to just not have video for this evening?
No, it's not, because it's the second time this has happened. This is very frustrating. I click on the link. I click on the link.
You know what? We are going to take this offline. We need to proceed with the program with the 42 people that will hear. If you could put your cell phone number in the chat, I will contact you directly.
I can't.
So Danny, back to you. And Dina, I think you had a question as well.
It was about the controversy.
Okay, good. Great minds think alike.
That's great. Thank you, Danny.
Oh, great. It was the same question. Okay, good. Yeah, and please feel free to throw questions into the chat while I'm talking, and we can take multiple questions at once. Sam, you were going to say something.
Yeah, stop me when I'm monopolizing, but I could talk for hours. So given that, I mean, I literally almost choked when you said the teacher didn't think that actually happened. But like, given that that's probably not uncommon, and maybe some people aren't as familiar with the non-Jewish victims and the T4 program, do you recommend that like there's a certain like resource? Like, do you have a reading guide that accompanies the book, or do you say like, hey, if you hear a teacher that's reading this with their class, like recommend that they go to a certain resource beforehand or prep them in any way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I developed through Northwestern and through Unsilenced, my nonprofit, a whole suite of educational resources and materials to accompany the book to help teachers teach not only the history, but also the narratives and the characters. All of the characters were based on, the characters are fictional, based on real testimony. All of the history in the book, everything that happens in public happened in history, with the exception of at least one historical error that a very astute reader noticed just after the book came out. Again, happy to talk about that later if anyone's interested. And so yes, we do have readers' guides, we have a web quest, we have lesson plans and recommended texts, non-fiction texts to accompany the book to help the history really come alive. We'd be very happy to share the link at the end, or I know an email goes out after each session, so we can absolutely send out the link for those who want to explore those materials. More questions? We can go in any direction, and any questions you have about the story, about the process of writing, anything you'd like to discuss at all. I think I see Dina's hand up.
Okay, you mentioned it, the historical error.
Okay. So it was really important. So maybe I should back up. So I wrote Train quite by accident. I actually used to belong to the school of thought argued by Ali Rizal and others who would make the case that Holocaust fiction isn't kosher, so to speak. I'm paraphrasing, that was my attempt at a joke. This idea that Holocaust fiction is a falsification of history. And I used to ascribe to that idea. I used to, when I trained educators, I would say, maybe we should be putting fiction aside. Maybe we should be prioritizing survivor testimony, documentary, primary sources, right, to teach this history. It's not as if this history isn't already compelling and engaging for young people. And then through my research, I started to ask the question. I grew up Jewish, and so my Holocaust education was pretty robust. I would say I went to the equivalent of a British Jewish day school, was involved in Jewish youth movements as a teenager. My family, we're connected to the Holocaust. My mom, who's here, my mom's dad, my grandpa, Maurice Ziekenopasser, escaped Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. We don't know exactly what happened to most of his extended family, but my upbringing and my education, I knew the Jewish narrative of the Holocaust really well. I also identify as gay. I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community, and it started to dawn on me, probably in my sort of late teens, early 20s. I sort of heard like snippets of educators mentioning very, very briefly that the Nazis also persecuted and murdered people from all these other different groups. And I remember homosexuals, gay men being mentioned as one of them, but no one ever sat me down and taught me that history. And I started to train as a learning scientist here at Northwestern, I started to develop my research questions, which was, why is it that Holocaust education so often excludes or marginalizes not only gay narratives, but also Roma and disabled and all these other groups? And so I'm a learning scientist and I'm an education designer, and I started to design a curriculum that would help teachers include these more marginalized narratives alongside the central Jewish narrative of Holocaust history. And I shared my early drafts of this non-fiction curriculum with a number of teachers who said to me, Danny, this is really dry. It's really hard to get into, in part because many of the testimonies that we were using were not in English. They're few and far between, right? So, like, for example, we only have, out of the thousands and thousands of survivor testimonies that we have in the USC Shoah Foundation, only something like 9 of those testimonies are testimonies of gay men who survived Nazi persecution. And so we didn't have that much material. And so the teachers who I was working with said, what we'd rather do is we'd rather teach novels, film, documentary, poetry. Let's lean on the arts. That's one way to engage our young people. Do you have recommendations for those texts? And I said, sure, because there are some texts out there. And we gave them a list of texts that they could read and also some texts that they could teach. And the teachers came back to me and said, no. We're only given maybe 2 hours, 3 hours at most to teach the whole of Holocaust history. Or maybe we only really have time to teach maybe one text, one film, one book. We don't have time to teach one documentary about the Roma and one book about the disabled and one feature film about homosexuals and to teach Night by Elie Wiesel and to teach Schindler's List and whatever they're teaching. Is there one text, one film or one book that includes all of these narratives? And I said, no, not that I know of, but let me see what I can do. And at the time, and this is an interesting twist to the story, but I certainly didn't have the budget to make a movie, at least not yet. And so I started to write these short stories that could sort of live together, that could be taught together, these fictionalized narratives based on testimony that could be really compelling as an entry point into for young people to be engaged in this history. And to cut a long story short, those short stories became Train, where I realized that those short stories could be intertwined, and I kind of found myself accidentally writing a novel. I used to joke that I didn't have the budget to make a film, but my fun news, if we have time today, we could talk about this later, is that I am now working on a screenplay with an incredible small team of co-writers, working with a film company out in LA. It's very early days, but it's very promising. It's very exciting, and it looks like Train won't be a movie, but the idea is that it will be a limited television series that isn't only the story from 1943, but it will also integrate the sequel that has been swimming around my head since I wrote Train, and will integrate what happened to some of the characters who may or may not have survived. And so the screenplay is set in 1963, 20 years later, and flashes back and forth between wartime and 1960s Europe and 1960s America as well. So I'm now forgetting the original question, which was around historical accuracy. So it was really important as I started to write the fictional narrative. It was really important that all of the history be accurate, and not only be accurate, but also be authentic. And I think there's a difference between historical accuracy and historical authenticity. And the one error, a few weeks after the book came out, a friend of mine reached out and said, well done on getting all the history, or almost all the history right. And I said, what do you mean almost all the history? So we had historians fact check everything, and it took years to get right. And he pointed out how in the paperback version, we corrected it for the Kindle version, but if you read the paperback, the mention of jet planes bombing Berlin halfway through the book is actually historically inaccurate, because jet planes were not introduced into the war for another few weeks. And so really they should be propeller planes, not jet planes. So that is, as far as we know, is the only, there may be more, but that's the only historical inaccuracy in the novel. More questions. I see there's Gail asks, how much did my doctoral thesis influence the book? And Ellie asks, as I was reading the book, I kept picturing it as a movie. So glad to hear it's going to be one. So start with my research. My doctoral thesis absolutely influenced the book. They're kind of, the novel is almost an extension of my doctorate. I studied how Holocaust educators perceive and teach about the Roma and homosexuals and the disabled and so on. And so how I wrote the book was very much, it was written as a text to teach in high school. It's taught in some middle schools as well, but I wrote it as a high school text. And it's exciting that it's still very widely taught in many states across the country. And this idea of picturing it as a movie, I actually, if I'm honest, I wrote it with the idea of a screenplay in mind. It's a thriller. There's all these twists and turns and cliffhangers, and so the hope is that the screenplay will be pretty true to what happens in the novel. More questions? You can throw them in the chat. You can raise. I see Ellie, your hand up. Hi, Ellie.
Hi, I'm curious. I read it as an adult, obviously, but I understand it's a young adult fiction. I'm very curious to know how kids have taken this in and their reactions to this.
Yeah. Michelle, FYI, the jet planes were German jet planes. Ah, wow. Wow. Thank you. Yeah, how do young people react? I'm at my desk. I try to show you. I get lots of notes from students, which is pretty incredible. Picking up a random note from a student. I really enjoyed blah 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 blah. And I just read your book. I really enjoyed learning about each character and their struggles. I really, hold on, I'm most curious about the cover design of the book. So sometimes I'll get questions and sometimes I'll reply. I do get lots of questions about the history. Here's another. I felt very connected to these characters that I had not thought of before can't read the writing, in the context of the Holocaust, especially the disabled characters. So that one of the responses we often get from students, especially in cities and towns where they don't meet survivors, they don't meet families of survivors, they don't even know, they never knowingly met anyone who is Jewish. The characters in the book, Victor, the disabled, the boy who was disabled, Elisa's brother, Sura and Marco and Kizzy, the Romani siblings and cousins, Marco and Alex being gay, Sura being sort of an activist, a political dissident. Students get to connect, right? The way young people learn, it's a very developmentally, young readers' identities really help them to engage with histories and with texts. And so by providing all of these different identities amongst the characters, it's actually a way to get students to invest in the story because they find one character to latch onto that they feel compelled to sort of like root for or identify with in a sense. And so as I was writing Train, I actually very intentionally made all of our 6 characters very different ages. So Kizzy is the youngest, she's 13. Sura is the oldest, she's 19. We have different ages for 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds. But we also have different personalities and different identities. And we also have this idea of intersectionality playing into the story, where individual characters actually have a number of different identities at the same time. Alex is Jewish and he's gay. He's also from a blended family, or an intermarried family. We have Ruth, who is Catholic. We have Elise, who is both a member of the German Girls League and her family is a Nazi family. But at the same time, her brother was murdered by the Nazis because he was disabled. She's haunted by Victor. He's her ghost, so to speak. And so we even have this idea of this family, Elise's family, being both perpetrators, being a Nazi family, and victims at the same time. And so students, from my experience, and I speak to a lot of schools, I go around, lots of Zoom calls in the last couple of years with the pandemic, but pre-COVID, I would visit different schools, different classrooms, and the students would love the complexities of the characters. Even Sura, so I talked about historical accuracy and historical authenticity. I think of Sura and how she responds to her brother coming out as gay, or not even coming out, she figures out that he's gay, right? He doesn't really tell her. And in the original draft of Train, so the text that you're reading is draft number 15. I rewrote it 15 times. In an earlier drafts, when Sura finds out that Marco is gay, I had her respond with like oh, that's cool, no problem. Like, good for you, I'll support you, I love you, I still love you. And I realized that what I was doing is I was projecting 21st century values onto this young woman who was living in 1943. That's not to say that there weren't allies in 1943, but I realized that Sura's response, considering that the culture she grew up in, the society she grew up in, and considering that she was forcibly sterilized because she's Roma, it made sense that she actually responds to Marco extremely negatively and sees his homosexuality as a threat to the future of their family. And so I rewrote Sura. She's kind of our hero all along. She opens the book and she closes the book, but she's made complicated by the fact that she shares her homophobia. She acts on her homophobia by rejecting her brother. And this, I think, makes Sura and many of the other characters very real and very authentic. So we can talk about historical accuracy, about getting all the facts correct, but we can also talk about historical authenticity. Are we telling a story that actually reflects the way people lived the history? Sam asks, what about the cover of the book? So the cover has its own story. I'll try to be concise. One of my readers, so I wrote 15 drafts. Each draft on average had 2 different beta readers giving me feedback. So I had something like 32 readers over 5 years. They're all named in the front of the book. I'm so grateful to all of them for their help and support and their feedback. One of the people that read the book, and probably the person I was most nervous to share the book with, is Ava Kaddison. Ava is an artist. Ava is a theater set designer. She trained in Tel Aviv. Ava is a writer, a vegetarian, which is an important part of her story. Ava is a Holocaust survivor. She wrote 2 of her own books. They're right here, Soundless Roar and Present Past. Soundless Roar is about Ava's time in hiding near Belgrade for 4 years during the Holocaust as a teenager. Present Past is about her post-war memories. She's also featured in Out of Chaos, which is a collection of stories and poems and artworks created by hidden children during the Holocaust. Highly recommended. Lots of Illinois Holocaust Museum connected survivors and families featured in this book. Ava was one of my readers. I was nervous to share the book with her because I was sharing it with someone who lived through it, right? Like, I was worried, am I am I representing the history in the way that it should be represented? And Ava gave me some incredible feedback, which went into some edits into the book. And I was blown away when Ava said to me that she would, should it be my choice? She'd be okay if I said no, but would I like to use one of her drawings for the cover of the book? She gave me 3 drawings that I could use. Incredibly, all these drawings were drawings that she had created years before. I chose this drawing out of the 3. You can see the full drawing on page 369 of the book. There are 6 figures representing the 6 protagonists. You can see 6 faces. I have my own interpretation of which figures represent each character. And then we have the color of the book. Originally, the book was going to be black and white, white with black lines. And to cut a long story short, my kid, when my kid was 3 years old, years ago, saw a draft of the book, and my kid said, "Daddy, I don't like the black and white color of the book." And I said, "Oh no, really?" And my kid said, can you change the color, make it colorful? And we played around with colors and landed on red, not because we wanted to land on red, but because the computer program, we had that like spinning rainbow wheel, it just got stuck on the color red. My computer just decided we were trying purple and blue and all these colors, and we got stuck on red. And I was really nervous because I felt like I was maybe disrupting, I don't know, the integrity of the original artwork. And so I took the red design to Ava, went to her home, which I'd been in many times, and said, "I want to ask your permission to print the book with a red cover," which is not how the original artwork was drawn. And Ava nodded her head and she pointed up to a painting that I'd seen so many times, but I'd never really paid attention to. It was a black and white painting with a red line running through it. And she said, "Do you see what the red represents?" And I assumed red, and Ava lives in Ava's home. It's almost like Ava lives in her own art gallery. It's filled with all of her artworks from her life. And she pointed to this painting and she said, "The red, many people think the red is for death or blood, but red is for blood, but blood symbolizes life. And so your book should be red because your story is about the struggle, the fight for life." And so that's the story of the book cover. I see Rosalind asked, "Is your book being banned in Texas?" I don't know. I assume that my book has been banned by certain schools and districts. I don't know. I haven't actually checked to see if it's on any banned book lists. Part of me, if I'm honest, hopes that it gets on some prominent banned book lists, because we know that banned book lists actually do the opposite of their intention. They actually lead to even higher rates of readership. So if you see that Train has been listed on a banned book list, please do let me know. I would love to know, and I'll probably be excited. I say that, I sound like I'm being facetious, but I say that because if people are really responding in that way, it probably means the story is really having its effect. I wrote it to challenge the way we remember this history. I wanted to expand the narrative. I wanted to push in a historically accurate and authentic way. I wanted to push the way that we think about Holocaust history, which is something we can talk more about if you're interested. And so, yeah, if you see it on any lists, let me know. More questions, anybody? I see, someone sent me a direct message. Is Ava the survivor who chose not to speak when she was in the camps, or is that another lady? Yeah, Ava spent 4 years pretending to be deaf and unable to speak. Ava grew up in a family where multiple languages were spoken. Ava grew up reading in many different languages. Ava's father was a classical musician. Ava, in her own words, in her book, says that if she opened her mouth and spoke, she would give away immediately that she was from sort of an intellectual family. And so the family, the farmers that hid her, they made the plan that she would pretend to be deaf and mute. And so she literally did not say a word for 4 years and pretended not to hear for 4 years. She lived amongst the animals on the farm, which is one of the reasons why Ava chose to become a vegetarian for her whole life. She says animals saved her life. And so she does not eat them. Yes, whoever wrote that's Ava. Any more questions?
Did you ever consider turning this book or this story into like a graphic novel? Or any of your short stories or anything into it?
That's a great question. I've had conversations with artists, not necessarily to turn to the sort of classic graphic novel, like mouse style, but we did have the idea at one point to illustrate each chapter. That might be something, if the book is republished, which is my hope, then I would love to see illustrations included, not just the 11 chapters, but perhaps accompanying their 6 mini chapters within each larger chapter. So I'd love to see some kind of illustration or drawing accompanying each, because it would be another way to engage young readers and another way to drive conversation and interpretation and engagement. So yes, so not a graphic novel, but an illustrated edition has been part of our conversations. Thanks, Sam. More questions? If you're not, if people don't have questions, I have questions for you. So I'm maybe I know we have like about 15 minutes left, so maybe we can turn the tables and I can throw out some questions. Michelle, were you going to say something?
I thought I saw someone trying to unmute themselves, but was Francine trying to speak up? I don't want to call you out if you weren't. Okay, I misinterpreted that.
Okay, so I'd love just to hear your reactions to Train in terms of, I'm always interested to know what you found most challenging or most surprising. I'd love to invite you to write inside the chat if you're able to, if that's easy for you. What did you find most surprising about reading Train? What in the history, many young people, many adult readers will often say, like, I have been reading about the Holocaust for decades, my whole life. I thought I kind of knew everything there was to know, and I found myself scratching my head, wondering why I'd never heard of X or whatever. Would anyone like to share, either in the chat or just speak briefly? What did you find to be most surprising? What jumped out at you while reading Train?
Hi, I'm Rosalind Hopen, and I just finished a book yesterday, and I was amazed by the book because it really brought out a whole area which I'm not familiar with, and I also have read tons of Holocaust books. I'm 90 years old, so I've had a lot of time to read. But I found your book most interesting, not knowing why you wrote the book, but having also Googled you a little more to have an idea where you were coming from. But what I really didn't know, which I found very interesting, was the women who got their husbands back. I never knew that there was a group of Jews still living in Berlin. And I actually thought they had cleared it all out. Never knew that particular aspect of the Holocaust. That was really fascinating.
Yes, Ellie wrote a very similar comment. I never knew people protested like the wives did, wanting their Jewish husbands back. And then Janine writes, Elisa's cutting surprised me. Would you explain your purpose for this? Yeah, I can absolutely do that. And I have oh my goodness, I just realized that there's someone that I know just private messaged me who wrote, the Rosenstrasse protest is hidden within the history, hashtag badass women. So first of all, the Rosenstrasse protest is one that is fairly well known. It's more well known in Germany, I would say, than it is outside of Germany. I included it for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted to find a moment in Holocaust history where the Jewish narrative really did come right up against the Roma narrative. And so the Rosenstrasse protest really did happen at the same time as the Nazis' deportation of their Roma prisoners, Roma and Sinti prisoners from their camp at Marzahn on the edge of Berlin. And it's my own interpretation or theory that they're connected, because the Rosenstrasse protest actually led the Nazis to halt the trains to the camps. And I'm always left wondering, did the Nazis then decide, in that case, let's deport the Roma now? Did the Rosenstrasse protest actually directly lead to the Nazis deciding to deport the Roma in that moment? They'd already decided they were going to deport the Roma in late 1942. That had already been decided. But I'm always wondering if the Rosenstrasse protest specifically led to the Nazis choosing that time to deport the Roma at Marzahn to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they had just set up the Roma camp, or the Nazis' camp for Roma families, the Zigeunerlager at Birkenau. So that was one reason why I chose those 10 days. It's also compelling, and it also places the Jewish narrative as central to the text of Train, even though we have just one Jewish protagonist, Alex, and we have 3 Roma protagonists. And so we could argue that the Roma narrative is central. The Rosenstrasse protest makes the Jewish narrative ever present. It also highlights an important lesson in the history, which is, hey, look what happens when you protest, right? In the middle of the Holocaust, we're 3.5 years into World War II. And all of these Christian women and their children decide that they're going to protest. It's cynically called a selfish protest, because those women did not choose to protest other roundups. As Sura says, why is nobody protesting the deportation of my family, right? But at the same time, it highlights that standing together against a dictatorship, against a murderous, genocidal dictatorship, can actually lead to positive results. And in this case, after the week or so of detaining these Jewish men and children and some women at Rosenstrasse, the Nazis released them, almost all of them. The arrest of or the deportation of some women from Rosenstrasse towards the end was real. The arrest of 10 women from the crowd, Sura being one of them, that really happened. Also, and this is addressed in the sequel, just because they were released from Rosenstrasse doesn't mean that they all survived the Holocaust. Many of the folks who were released from Rosenstrasse, the Nazis essentially just changed their tactics and deported them in smaller numbers rather than all at once. And so many of the folks who were released from Rosenstrasse many of them were still sent to the camps and murdered in the Nazis' gas chambers.
I'm going to do a time check. We have
Yes.
a question in the chat from Pinky Fox, and then Ellie's had her hand up a couple of times.
Okay.
And we're about 8 minutes before the hour. So
Great.
if anyone has any last minute questions, I'd put them in the chat quickly. We'll let Ellie ask hers, and then Danny, I'll put it back to you.
Great. Yeah, Ellie, what's your question?
So not only was I surprised and never knew about the women protesting, but I'm equally surprised that the Nazis tolerated it.
Yes. Well, the Nazis were really concerned about public opinion, right? They really knew that their power rested in the public. All governments understand this, whether they're democratic or not. And so propaganda and trying to control public opinion is what kept the Nazis in power. It's what led to them being able to do what they were trying to do. Janine wrote Elise's cutting surprised me. Would you explain this really briefly? Elise, what I wanted to do, and this is actually often a question amongst many young people who maybe some of whom are familiar with self-harm or have friends or cousins who may self-harm. And I made sure to check that the phenomenon of self-harm has been around forever, was first documented and researched at the end of the 19th century. So I wanted to make sure I wasn't inserting a modern day phenomenon into this time period. So I made sure of that. But Elise is, and I often ask young people, well, why do you think Elise is cutting herself? And it's this idea of Elise's guilt around her brother Victor, who haunts her. Her guilt that he was murdered, her guilt that she didn't do anything, her guilt that she did not visit him in hospital, she refused to go. So I wanted a way to sort of represent Elise's struggle with what to do with, like as I mentioned before, this idea, are her family's perpetrators? Her mother is certainly an anti-Semite and anti-Roma, yet her son, Elise's brother, was murdered. And so this idea of Elise cutting herself calls attention to this struggle. So that's my short answer to that question. The question around the boy who dressed as a Nazi, is that Marco who put on the uniform? Is that the question, Pinky? Because we have Dieter, who is a Nazi guard at Rosenstrasse, who is a closeted gay man. He rapes Alex. This was another issue that makes the book controversial, which is that Alex, and some students pick up on it and some don't. Alex is sexually assaulted. He's raped in the office. Again, this is a reflection of the real history, gay prisoners being raped by Nazi officers and guards in the camps, in prisons, in detention. I worked with my editor, Krista Desir, to write it in a way that you can kind of miss it. You kind of have to read between the lines. There are clues, there are hints. So that's Dieter. And then Pinky writes about Marco, who confronted the guard. This was actually inspired by a real story. Gad Beck, who during the Rosenstrasse protest, he was a Jewish teenager. He had a boyfriend who was also arrested during the Rosenstrasse protest, a secret boyfriend. And he put on a Nazi youth uniform and pretended to be sent to go get his boyfriend. He obviously didn't say, come to get my boyfriend. He just gave his boyfriend's name. And the Nazis believed him and they allowed him out. And his boyfriend, God's boyfriend, said, my family is sick and I have to go back. I cannot run away with you. And he returned, and God's boyfriend and his family were murdered. This was not at Rosenstrasse. This was in the building where Kizzy was being held a few blocks away. because there were different detention centers. And so the idea of Marco putting on that uniform was actually inspired by the story of Gad Beck, the true story. That story is told by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. You can, I'll type in the spelling of his name in case you want to look him up. And the documentary paragraph 175, which is a documentary about the Nazis' persecution of homosexuals, Gad is featured in that documentary too.
So we're at about 3 minutes till. Danny, I'm going to offer you any closing remarks
Sure.
to this group, and then I'll jump back in.
So there's so much to say. I think what's on my mind right now, I didn't quite expect it, but I'm very excited that I'm now working with screenwriters to turn the novel and the sequel in my head and in my notes into a screenplay. So I'm actually like back into the history pretty much every day right now. So this has turned into a project that's sort of been going on for, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 years, which is exciting. I'm really excited that the screenplay will go way beyond 1943 and will actually include many other hidden stories, not only of the Holocaust itself, but what happened after the Holocaust, the denial of victimhood, the denial of reparations, the stories of sexual violence, the stories of forced sterilizations, how American doctors and scientists and eugenicists supported what was happening in Germany, in Nazi Germany. The connection between US history and German history and Holocaust history is another neglected or marginalized history. And so I don't know what the timeline will be. We're probably looking at a good few years before any TV show will come out. You never know, it might happen sooner. And so I hope you'll invite me back for another conversation to talk about the limited TV series. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to talk about my work. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Marcy and Michelle and everyone else and the museum. And if you do have any questions, you're welcome to message me directly. I'd be very happy to answer them. It's just been a pleasure to speak with you and see so many old friends and new friends too. Thank you, everybody.
Well, and
thanks
you,
to my
Danny.
mom. Hi, Mom. Thanks, Mom.
Thank you, Danny, for a really tremendous program. I think we all enjoyed it. A little bit of housekeeping on our end. If you'd like to fill out a survey, Michelle will put it in the chat. We love hearing from you. That's how we make these programs better, particularly this book club, which is still in its first year. So we love hearing feedback. Our programming can all be accessed at our website under our programming and events page. We invite you to visit and notice our brand new website. Our next One Museum Book, One Book book club will be not till January. So we're taking the holidays off, and then we'll be back to talk about The Assignment, which is actually a book that came out of an assignment made to some high schoolers. And they said, no, we're not doing this, and how that all influenced their community. So I think it'll be a great discussion. And then our next program, which you can get to all of our programs on our programming page, but the next one is a lunch and learn on my family's history, Jewish victims and fighters during the Holocaust. And that will take place on November 6th. Oh, it took place today. Sorry. Next one is the 18th, which is a book and author on the House of Fragile Things, Jewish art, collectors, and the fall of France. So our programs continue to inform and challenge and expand your horizons. We're so glad you're here. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.